My paper is referring not to a geographical region of Polesie, but to area of the former district of Polesie, województwo polskie. It was the largest Polish administration district before the Second World War. On the other hand, it was the most neglected one from the economical and social point of view. About 1.1 million people were living in this district according to the census of December 1931. Among them predominated a number of local peasant Orthodox population speaking mostly local Belarusian dialect. Persons claiming Polish nationality created not more than 14%. The third national group were Jews with about 10%, and the fourth one were Ukrainians with about 4.5%. Before September 1939, the Poles had built up the ruling strata of the local society as state official, policemen, soldiers, managers of the state-owned enterprises in the cities, and landowners in the country. There were relatively few Polish peasants. Many of them settled down only after the First World War as so-called military and civilian colonists. Jews created about 50% of all city dwellers. 36% of Jews used to live in the country, having worked as craftsmen and traders. Some few percent of them were farmers, Jewish businessmen who were leaders in commerce, industry, and communication enterprises. It is necessary to stress that 24% strong combined Polish-Jewish minority concentrated political and financial power of the area. The local Orthodox population of Belarusian or Ukrainian language was weak from the economical point of view and political point of view. The Ukrainians were living mostly in counties neighboring in the south the Volyn district, województwo wołyńskie. No doubt that the main reason of social unrest at that area was the poverty and national structure of the population. In my opinion, the most significant conflict resulted from the structure of share of income. In Polesie, the main benefactors of the local economical structures were Poles. The Jews took the second position. Both groups, as such, differed from the surrounding peasants in many dimensions: religion, language, the level of average wealth and access to the consumption goods, the level of education and political role. There was a very high percentage of illiterates among the village people, in some counties even 70%. And here in the south, it is a former county Kamień-Kościerski. The percentage of illiterates in the late 1930s was 70%. And the percentage of Poles over there before the war was only 7%. So the area was predominantly Ukrainian one. This part, and the second one here, it is the former county with a capital in the city of Stolin. There is no doubt that for the overwhelming majority of the local society, the Polish state of those days was not their own one, but only the communists and Ukrainian nationalists were ready to fight against Polish rule. The others were simply working. They knew what meant war, death and disaster. The memory of the former war was still fresh. For my story, important is fact that there were people in Polesie who awaited changes and were prepared to have their part in carrying them out. both political activists but also common criminals. Period from September 1939 to the German attack on Soviet Union. The first stage of total social turmoil took place when both Wehrmacht and Red Army crushed the Polish state in September 1939. Hundreds of the communist and Ukrainian activists used opportunity to attack representatives of the Polish ruling strata. They took over arms and places. Part of peasants followed them, attacking homes and palaces of landowners. In order to use vacuum of power for robbery like they did 20 years earlier, what happened in 1919 and 1920. The goal were Polish policemen, soldiers, wood guards, landowners, and refugees traveling the side roads. Those who thought to be victims of the Polish state took political revenge. Some simply used the cars for robbery, which they had already practiced before the war. As at the end of the First World War, once again townsmen started to, 20 years ago, once again townsmen started to organize self-defense to protect people and property. Members of the communist underground founded Red Militia. An interesting situation took place in a city of Telechane, 60 kilometers north to Pinsk. And police officer gave over the rifles to local rabbi, and then rabbi organized a meeting for the population of the town in front of the people. They were standing together, police officer, the rabbi, and several local communists who had just founded the temporary committee to control the town until arrival of the Red Army. This case shows to some extent a situation of creating the temporary local authorities predominated by people who thought they could represent the population in front of new rulers. We can name another such examples from towns as Bereza Kartuska, Kamień Koszyrski, and Łuninec. During 21-month-long Soviet rules, the traditional social structure was destroyed. Thousands of local Polish, Jewish, and other leaders were forced to escape or were arrested and sent to the east to the concentration camps. At least several categories of the former higher social groups disappeared from Polesie, but first of all, Polish landowners. Then other leaders of Polish society, and at the end, Jewish businessmen and political activists. Maybe because of the lack of time, the Soviets did not harm much the cadres of Christian clergy and rabbis. Most of them were on spot when the Third Reich attacked the Soviet Union. The destruction of the old world angered thousands of people who blamed not only the Soviet aggressors but also their local helpers. You can assume that every arrest, every destroyed or confiscated enterprise created new enemies of the Soviet regime. One fact, very important for the context, must be named. Only relatively few Poles who were sent from Polesie to the Soviet concentration camps mentioned in their testimonies, I mean the collection in Hoover archive, the participation of the Jews as such in the Soviet persecutions. It means that these Poles knew that also thousands of Jews were among the victims of the Soviet regime. The question is, to what extent that fact was noticed also by the people who were still in Polesie on 22nd of June 1941. Probably anti-Semites added simply facts of a pro-Soviet collaboration to the pre-war catalogue of anti-Jewish arguments, prejudice, and like earlier, the general situation was of no importance for them. The other people who had normal relations with Jewish neighbors realized what the Soviets did to the Jews as a national and religious community. In my opinion, there were about 110,000 Jews in Polesie when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The city of Brest-Litovsk, was taken on the first day of war. Pinsk on the 6th of July. The Wehrmacht crossed the former Polish-Soviet border in this region 2 days later, on the 8th of July. Describing an attitude of local Gentiles towards the Jews in those days, one has at first to distinguish between towns and villages, which went almost immediately from the Soviet to German hands, and the others, where the vacuum of power lasted relatively long time. I mean 2 or even 6 weeks. In such towns as Pinsk and Uniniec, the Soviets left shortly before the arrival of German soldiers. But there were towns, even capitals of former Polish counties, where Germans appeared only after several weeks because these places were far away from the main roads of attack. In Polesie, Germans did not tolerate such pogroms like in Lwów, Kaunas or Jedwabne. From the very beginning, military authorities introduced special signs for Jews, compulsory work or Jewish council, but no street uncontrolled violence committed by local Gentiles was allowed. If it happened, it was only before coming of the Germans. But I found no information on killing the Jews in larger towns before the Germans arrived. From testimonies of the former inhabitants of several towns, such as, for example, Lenin and Łachwa. Lenin is a small border city, and Łachwa was close to it. Example, Lenin and Łachwa. We know about peasants gathering in the vicinity, awaiting for something with empty sacks and carts, awaiting for something. They were ready to start robbery, but failed the moment, and the Germans did not allow them to attack Jews. In Janów Poleski, mob entered the town. Jews asked Orthodox and Catholic priests for help. The peasants did not want to hear requests of a priest, but were quickly pushed out by the local Christians armed with axes and other farm tools. So the city dwellers in the city of Janów Poleski pushed out the plunderers. In Telechany, the mob of the town, hooligans and peasants, robbed not only abandoned state shops, also Jewish homes. Here in Telechany, these were Germans who stopped this robbery and looting. There was another way of doing in the southern part of Polesie. First of all, in towns Stolin and Kamień-Koszyrski, with this Ukrainian population with a larger percentage. Over there, a vacuum of power lasted even 5-6 weeks, as the Soviets escaped very quickly and Germans came at the end of July as a permanent power. In both cases, aggression was stimulated by the local Ukrainian nationalists. What can be of some significance, the Jews composed their minority group and Ukrainians were organized. But I have to stress that no sign of connection of the local Ukrainians with leader of Sicz Poleska, Taras Bulba Borowiec, has been traced up to now. First temporary mayor of Stalin was a Pole with a good attitude to Jews. He was quickly forced to resign and was replaced by an Ukrainian nationalist. Another Ukrainian nationalist was in charge of temporary militia. Gangs of Ukrainians started attacking Jewish homes. When they were pushed back by the Jewish men, they came again in larger numbers. They had beaten people, smashed furniture, and robbed small movables. No Jew could feel safe. Only Germans put an end to this kind of aggression and started their own one. In this context, interesting is the experience of Michał Nostanczuk from Stalin, who before the war ran the family mill in village Rublie. Stalin, Rublie, and I will mention also the city of David Grudek close to it. He took part in the clash with the Ukrainians who attacked his parents' home in Stalin. After that attack, parents asked him to run away to Rublie. In Rublie, he was at first very warmly welcomed by the peasants, who at once gave him back keys to his mill, keys taken away by the Soviets. Nostanczuk noticed with time a change in an approach of the Gentile neighbors in Rublie to him. It was directly connected with the peasants, visits to the town of David Grudek, where a gang of anti-Semites took over power, supported by a man who escaped from the column of the prisoners led by the Soviets to the east. This man swore a revenge to the Jews. He blamed them for own suffering because he was investigated by a member of the NKVD of a Jewish origin. It meant nothing to him that among prisoners were Jews, and one of them had even run away with him from the transport to the east. The anti-Semitism of the new temporary rulers of David Grudek was obvious and open, but for some reasons they did not decide to commit a mass murder personally. The same situation was in Kamień-Koszyrski. There was no murdering even of the former communist activists or member of their families until the Germans came. On the other hand, in town of Lubieszów, some 30 kilometers northeast from Kamień-Koszyrski, local anti-Semites murdered 24 Jews, accusing them of close collaboration with the Soviets. Polish witnesses claimed after the war, during investigation, that at first there was a combined Polish-Ukrainian temporary civil guard, but after several weeks the Poles were fired. Still, it means that at the beginning there were Poles and Ukrainians in the group, and they all were responsible for what was done to the Jews. What attracts the attention is the reaction of the Germans who required an end of uncontrolled plundering and killing. In Lubieszów, Germans punished the murderers. In Kamień-Koszyrski, the situation developed in another way. When Germans came for the first time to the town, they noticed signs of plundering simply in the street, so they ordered the Ukrainians to stop it. The command was given to Ukrainian militia, but nothing had changed, and coming next time, Germans found similar picture. The reaction was quick and brutal. Members of the militia were shot down, and new people were mobilized as auxiliary policemen. Various witnesses from various towns mention specific behavior of Gentiles who robbed the Jewish property. Very often the bandits came at night. After the robbery, they forbade the Jews to mention the fact to the Germans, otherwise they would come to take revenge. The robbers obviously were afraid of a German reaction. People who created local militia in June-July 1941 were generally accepted by the German military commanders of the place, Ortskommandant, as so-called auxiliary police, Hilfspolizei Ordnungsdienst. Among them there were Belarusians, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, and local ethnic Germans. When in Berlin was taken a decision to start mass annihilation of Jews in the area of so-called Pripyat marshes in August 1941, the local auxiliary police helped in various ways to carry out that plan. The policemen helped to gather Jews, to search flats for hidden persons, to lead them to the ditches, and were surrounding as guards the killing areas. They were doing in the similar way everywhere. There were hundreds of them in Polesia already in first weeks after the German attack. But what was the attitude toward Jews of 1 million other Gentiles in Polesia in these days? For sure, part of them was ready to rob Jews, to attack them, and took part in this robbery. But how many? I do not know. At the end, one must ask the question, whether were there pogroms in Polesia in early summer of 1941? No doubt we have information that pogroms took place in several towns and villages. Crimes that happened there at that time meet the definition of pogrom as an act of hatred directed against one group of population for reason of its ethnic, racial, or religious origin. This aggression resulted in plunder, beating, humiliation, rape, and death of the members of this group. In his book, In the Shadow of Giants, Pogroms in 1941 in the former Soviet occupation zone, Witold Mendykowski asked, among others, two questions. First, did the pogroms of those days were part of Holocaust? And the second question, had presence or awaited coming of Germans been one of the reasons for these pogroms that had made them easier? No doubt, in Polesia, the anti-Jewish activity of small part of the local Gentiles was part of Holocaust, not only because it harmed the Jews directly, also because such criminal doings helped to terrorize the Jews and other Gentiles. The answer for the second question, in my opinion, German aggression was a crucial factor, sine qua non factor. Why? Because there were no anti-Jewish pogroms in Polesia in September 1939, even during this vacuum of power time. It happens that Soviets did not enter for a week or something like this, and there were no anti-Jewish pogroms 2 years earlier in this area. Somehow, aggressors knew who could be attacked at the moment as they knew 22 months earlier. Thank you.
What was omitted by historians was discussed in Russian literature. I would like to point out on Red Cavalry story by Isaac Babel, and there are numbers of stories discuss violence against women, rape of women, and other issues. For example, in Russian it calls "У батьки нашего Махна" story, and in English it calls Makhno's boys, where he described how 6 Makhno soldiers, Makhno was anarchist leader during the civil war in Ukraine, 6 Makhno soldiers raped a Jewish girl, and how feels this girl next day after she was raped. And there are a number of other stories that also touches. Also, I think there was, we can say, secondary discussion without names of victims of these pogroms, because in art also rape of women receive representation. We have one example of art, but there are also a series of work of Zahar Rybak, a Ukrainian Jewish artist, and in several of them he depicted rape of women, women with cut stomachs and so on. The only other evidence in literature about rape I found in book by Gusiev Orenbursky. It book basically of evidence about pogroms during Civil War. It calls Bagrovaya Kniga or Crimson Book, and he described rape of Jewish women there also. But he was not a professional historian. He was priest who just tried to gather testimonies about horror of these pogroms during the Civil War. My question to Gur Leroy, whether this violence also was spread on Gentile women during the Civil War, and whether this violence started against Jewish women during Civil War or still during World War I by Russian army. So I will appreciate answer for these questions. Other two papers focus on first weeks and first months of the war in Galicia and Polessia, and they analyze the role of Ukrainian nationalist organization, for example, OUN, different faction of this organization, Melnik faction, Bandera faction, and also spontaneous pogroms that organize local Ukrainian population. And my question to Professor Struve, why Ukrainian nationalists hope that Nazi will help them establish own state? Why they did not learn their lesson from the Civil War, when actually Germans occupied Ukraine, but they arrested then Petlura, Vinichenko, leaders of Ukrainian states, and same fate basically faced Bandera after declaration of independent states. Germans, during World War I, as well as Nazis during World War II, never promised Ukraine independent state. And during World War II, it was even more obvious because they talk about Lebensraum, living space. They come to take this territory, not establish their national states. So, what is false hope? Why they hope on this? And other. My question to Professor Struve. I recently read an article by John Paul Himka about pogrom in Lviv in 1941 that calls the Lviv pogrom of 1941, the Germans, Ukrainian nationalists, and a carnival crowd, where Professor Himka stated that according to internal German security report dated 16 July, police, he means Ukrainian police, captured and shot 7,000 Jews in Lviv. So he based his evidence on German security report. You mentioned number in 10 times lower, like several hundred Jews. So my question, what kind of sources you use and why numbers in historical literature about same pogrom so different? I don't know what the number is correct, what is incorrect, but I still saw several publications that mentioned a number from 4,000 to 7,000 victims of this pogrom. And about Grzegorz Behrendt paper, why Polish population had, since in Polessia, much better attitude to Jews than Ukrainian local population. I mean, we talk about mayor of Stolin, who was Paul first, and that had good attitude toward Jews. And we know that pogroms mostly organized Ukrainian nationalists and some local Ukrainian anti-Semites. Sometimes it was encouraged by Nazis, sometimes it happened spontaneously because local Ukrainian anti-Semites knew that there would not be punishment for this, or they hope that the Germans will just reward them for these pogroms. But why local Polish population did not do this? And also, just for my curiosity, how many Jews, if there are some number exist, survive Holocaust in Malaysia? Thank you very much.
Thank you. There are, but this hope can be explained. What supported it was, on the one hand, it probably was the only chance that was in any way visible to us. Establish a Ukrainian nation state at that time. That means with the help of the Germans as a result of the war against the Soviet Union. And the other, perhaps more important factor is that there was a certain group within the German leadership that was in support of a kind of, perhaps on the example of Slovakia or Croatia, kind of Ukrainian state that was where these people with whom the Bandera primarily cooperated, it was in the military leadership in the Abwehr, and it was also supported by the designated minister for the occupied Soviet territories, Alfred Rosenberg, but his political concept for these territories, he became the minister, but his political concept for these territories was not adopted by Hitler in a meeting on the 16th of July 1941, and then there was made the final decision that the Ukrainian territories will be divided in one part for the Generalgouvernement and one part that will be ruled by Germans, the so-called Reichskommissariat Ukraine. The second question was referred to the important article by John Paul Himka about the pogrom in Lvov. I don't have any differences with John Paul Himka on this issue. He rather avoids in his article any clear statement about the number of victims, and gives a rather wide range. But I don't think that he mentioned 7,000. 7,000 is a number that appears in the one report of the Einsatzgruppe C from Lvov, and that is a number that there appears as the number of people who have been executed by the Einsatzgruppe in the middle of July 1941. But also this, and that is, I think, all scholars who have researched these issues, this number also for executions of the Einsatzgruppe is much too high for this period. There's no, maybe it's a writing error, or no one really knows what is the background or basis for this number. It's also maybe they wanted to exaggerate their achievements, or maybe I would rather assume that it's a kind of writing error that appears in this document.
I will repeat. As long as it was possible for Poles to be members of this temporary militia, civil guards, auxiliary police, we can find Poles who were there. They decided on their own. I do not know their origin, the social background. I can confirm that there were people, but in all this documentation, all the sources, I found no information, no sign that a Pole, doesn't matter regarded before war activist or an ordinary person, organized an aggression, an attack on the Jewish population. Organized, was in charge of it. Maybe it happened, but I did not find any sign of this in the...
It didn't happen. It didn't happen. There were no pogroms against Jews in Polska. I checked it very carefully.
my
I
opinion,
made homework before this conference.
yes, my opinion is different when we take
So
into
tell
account
us
what
about
did happen in Stalin, what did happen in Stalin, what did happen in Kamil Koszewski, first of all in Lubieszów. So I mean, it met within the definition. What happened in Stalin with this first mayor, temporary mayor, it simply happened that he was an honest man with no anti-Jewish prejudice. There was also a Catholic priest known as a friend of the local rabbis. In this specific, I do not want to generalize. It happened in this specific town, like this. And then, as it happened in Wołyń, in Galicia, and in the southern part of former Polish districts, Ukrainian nationalists took over power over where at the beginning Poles started to regain their role pre-war war. They were trying, they succeeded for several days, several weeks, and then it was stopped. And we can find information about this general situation also in the reports of Einsatzgruppen. That there was a struggle between Poles and Ukrainians in Galicia in June, July, the first days. And then Germans general decided to choose Ukrainians as mayors and as person in charge of the local administration. And so this is I didn't find any information, and I found information. The Ukrainian nationalists organized the aggression. So it is the reason why I place such a comment in my paper. How many Jews survived? Several thousand Jews escaped for ghettos and gulags, labor camps. In 1942, only several hundred of them survived until spring of 44. We can't forget also many Jewish partisans or people who just survived on the so-called Aryan side, who were mobilized to the Red Army. And in a lot of testimonies and in books, memoirs, I found information about Jews who survived the Nazi occupation and died as soldiers of the Red Army in 44 and 45 fighting Nazis. Many of them from this area in the direction of East Prussia.
I wonder, the striking image that you showed and some of the examples you gave, these are soldiers, outsiders. Do you have testimonies of neighbors and how this changes or doesn't?
Sorry.
Neighbors raping people that were known by name, because you have 6 men, this, but then halachic, how was it solved? You just alluded to Mamzerut. Do you have the literature on how it's solved?
My question is related to what she says. In the earlier period that I do on Galicia, much less serious violence, of course, but in 1898, after this violence, Jewish reaction went in several different directions, much of it total criticism of the Hasidic leaders, who responded to it by saying, at least one, Rebbe Halberstam, who says, this happens because we're just leaving Jewish tradition, we have to just be more religious, that's why God is punishing us. and the Zionists, the small pockets of Zionist voices who denounce them. These rebbes are, this is what's keeping us back, and they don't understand the times, and we need to become Zionist, right, and leave this kind of garbage behind. And the sort of liberal, not totally liberal, but however you put it, the self-defense organizations in Vienna send out surveys to try and figure out what's going on. And the questions they ask in these surveys are totally anti-Hasidic from the beginning. How much control do the Hasidic rebbes have over the Jews? Is this why they're so debased, and the problem with the Polish population leads to violence and so on? So it's very much an internal critique of these rabbis who say to the experience of violence, we must return to the tradition. This is the answer. So if these rabbis can't do anything about these children, thousands of people raped and destruction, and what is there must be attacks on these rabbis from Zionists and other voices, and I'm just curious if you see that in this context. I mean, these women, do they stay in the Hasidic or the Orthodox fold there after such an experience? What happened? What is the relationship with these rebbes and who may still be around down there? I mean, it's different in Odessa than it is in Galicia, I know.
Thank you. Go.
Yeah. The testimonies that I gave in my lecture were of women that raped by, at least some of them by the neighbors, not by soldiers. The case of Rivka Schiff in Kishinev, there were neighbors, and this is a very detailed testimony, and she knows the rapist very, very well. Also in other towns during the Civil War, some were soldiers, some were the neighbors. The quotation of Shechtman, he speaks about the White Army, and but there is many cases of the peasants, the neighbors of the Jews.
But the question is, do they then stay in the same place? And
my problem in my research is the silence of the documents. This is the main problem. There is nothing. I wasn't surprised that I didn't find documents or public discussions in the periodicals, but I was very surprised that I didn't find in the archives material. You know, the JDC sent so many delegations and put so much money to help the refugees, and I didn't find a report about the rape. There is silence around the phenomena. So I really don't know what the rabbi said, what the Zionists said, what was the attitude of the Jewish society in general to the phenomena. Maybe David knows, in 1926 or 7, the Schwarzbad trial. I'm curious, during the trial, there were testimonies about rape, because they collected so many documents about everything, but I'm not sure about the
No, there weren't during the trial, but much of the evidence that was compiled for use of the defense by the
Raise up your voice.
by the East European Jewish Historical Archive, Cherkova and Shechtman and these people, does contain evidence of rape. They were very interested in getting this into the record of the trial, which is why, as I say, you have this tabulation of cases in which rape occurred. It didn't come out in the trial testimony because Schwarzbad's defense attorney figured he had enough with 11 witnesses to get what he wanted, and didn't call the other 83 that had been summoned to testify. So, but in the material that they assembled, there is considerable amount of testimony about the non-black.
This is my methodological problem. The silence after the pogroms, and I'm trying to expand it, but the silence exists only
It's a shame.
the other examples I brought from Japan and the Chinese women, from the Nuremberg, from Tokyo, and other cases, except Yugoslavia, which is, I would say, turning point in that case. And the first time we are guilty in mass
I would like to add the proceedings of a conference last week in Berlin about gender, memory, and genocide, which was discussing the Armenian case. And in the Armenian case, you have exactly the same pattern. Many thousands of Armenian women being raped, many thousands of Armenian women being converted by force, and what you have, the problem there is not the halacha, obviously, but you have the same very severe silencing and policing of messages about the genocide. So I think a comparative perspective to the Armenian case is very interesting, and there's quite a lot of research going on. And I think the echo is, the resonances are very, very similar. And what is one way to look at it is to look at what women's organizations do. Because they were normally taking responsibility for these, for victims of sexual violence. Yeah.
I'm wondering, since you've looked at all of these things, did you find that that among the Gentiles that were less nationalized, so the local, so in Palesia we have a lot of people that didn't really have a fixed national identification, that that those people or that those areas displayed less anti-Jewish feeling and were more peaceful than places where people had a stronger identification with one of the dominant nationalities?
I'm puzzled by this low lethality of the anti-Jewish aggression in Eastern Galicia. If you know, let's say high estimate 11,000, out of which 60% by Waffen-SS Viking, which makes up to 5,000 people killed by the locals. In a relatively large region with some 1 million of Jewish population in total. When you compare it to a very small region of Łomża-Grajewo, you may sum up to almost the same amount of people killed in something like 10% of the much smaller space and much greater proportion. Well, the percentage of killed people in the general Jewish population was much more higher. Why such a discrepancy? And then you may go up to Lithuania, although it's much later. I mean, it's then when you have evidently orders to kill all the Jews. So it's difficult to compare with the first weeks after the invasion. But still, the patterns of killing in the first weeks of the invasion against the Soviet Union are strikingly different.
The problem with Poleshuce, so this Belarusian language, local population, is that it is, let's call them silent society. They left no information, almost no memoirs. I went through publication of historians from Belarus and from Russia. And of course, these people who work in Minsk, in Brest, in Moscow, would be able to find memoirs of the local population. They were not able to use such a material because such a material does not exist. The problem is, for example, with testimony of writers among the nations from Belarus, peasant people, who were listened by members of Spielberg crew. in 90s and the beginning of 21st century. They asked questions of people, and they were almost unable to tell their story of help, because they were so simple, uneducated. They did what they did. And try to listen to these testimonies. They tell almost nothing. They did what they did. They helped because for religious reasons, because they knew the Jews. They helped, but it is difficult for them to tell their story. And I can assume, I can build a hypothesis that there was another reason, that scientists who were doing research, ethnographical research in Polesia in 1920s and 1930s, mark very strongly a very strong tie between Poleszucy, these peasants, and the Jews, because from the maybe not medieval, from the 18th, 19th century, still in the interwar period, Jews from the neighbor close town were go between them as village people and the outside world. They did not trust other people, for example, Poles. They trust their Jews. So it is like this. They didn't trust a Pole from Palace. They didn't trust a Polish official. They didn't trust a Polish policeman. They trust a Jew they knew. Maybe here is and as they were illiterates. So come to look such an idea, because they were illiterates, they did not know the anti-Jewish propaganda. And they treated Jews because of their connections, not because of the ideology. Maybe.
Hi.
Yes,
I don't know.
My conclusion would be a little bit different. I believe that in nearly all cases with deadly violence, some organized groups were involved, as in Eastern Galicia, who had intended to take over power, to remove the old groups and those who they considered to be enemies. And that you have in Eastern Galicia with the Ukrainian nationalists. The same you have in Lithuania. In Lithuania, the violence even started earlier than in Western Ukraine, because it was earlier occupied by the Germans. It's not so well researched so far, except for the city of Kaunas. You probably have some similar things also in Latvia, but on a very much smaller level of violence. And the interesting question is, what is about the Polish territories? And that what I already suggested in the session before, we have to look at these groups. We have these people who did it, and what did they do. And I think it would be an interesting trail also to look towards the Polish underground in that region. That was for the Poles. This was also a kind of shift of regimes. The Soviet regime and the Soviet local people were removed, and new people took over. And who were these people, and what did they when they took over power?
A model of modern nationalism didn't rooted in Belarusia very strong, and it's even till today Belarusian nationalistic party are very weak and small, and this is one of the reasons. And another one of lack of anti-Jewish enmity The other one is connected with this, that Russia was free of this wave of pogroms of 19th century and of beginning of 20th century. They moved from Ukraine westward to Poland into Polish lands, but they didn't go to Belarusia, and this wave didn't move to Belarusia and to Lithuania. There was no pogroms in Lithuania. But Lithuania adopted very quickly nationalism, Western kind of nationalism with anti-Semitism as one of the tool of nationalistic ideology.
Alina, but Pińsk is part of Polesia. Kamień Koszylski with 120 victims in September 1920 is part of Polesia. A pogrom in the capital of the district in Brześć in 37 is Polesia. An attempt of starosta to organize a pogrom in Kamień Koszylski in 36 is Polesia. So there was a tragic experience of anti-Jewish aggression in this area.
Did you find that many of the non-Jews, or a significant number of the non-Jews, are religious dissenters? The Subotenki, and perhaps there's a role here. And also, just it seems that Poles and Jews tend to get along much better in areas where they're both small minorities than when one is a significant majority. This is true in many parts of Lithuania, for example, and it may be something that's going on here as well.
So let's take Natalia's question.
Just a material question. Did you look at the sierpniówki?
Yes. So I covered also the problem with so-called sierpniówki is that the overwhelming majority of police officer, secret service police, prosecutors did not ask what was going at the beginning of 1941. I covered several dozens investigation connected with activity of this auxiliary policemen captured in Poland after the war, and only in one case was a case of participation in a crime committed generally by Germans in August 41 with help of auxiliary police, and they didn't ask the question. So they start later, 42, 43, they were especially interested in activity against Soviet partisans, murdering of the local Aryan population. Generally, in 1940s, 1950s, they did not ask question about annihilation of Jewish population. It is terrible. Unique opportunity to get material, and they did not ask these questions
I have
at
this
the
in
time.
Eastern Galicia, but it's usually Jewish witnesses who testify.
And about, so I found from testimonies of these people who survived the whole time on the Aryan side, and they went from one village on Hutor to another. Among such places they met also members of these different religious groups who tried to make Jews to convert to their religions, and very often it was the reason for Jews to leave, to look for another place. So and some survivors found help by these people, and then eventually arrived at the troop of the Soviet partisans, and with Soviet partisans survived until 1944.
I don't see any more hands up, so join me in thanking our panelists and our commentator.